gotta get myself one of those like Peter Lingdon style motorized backdrops.
Take two. I bought my very first cinema camera, and here's why. Now, before we start, I want to quickly mention that a new pack, Scopes, is finally out. I announced it last week, and it's here. It's a collection of HUDs, glitch distortions and overlays and LUTs, and just a bunch of stuff that can give you either a retro or futuristic look. But check it out, Kriscoart.com/marketplace, or click the link in the description. Okay, so let me put a little disclaimer here before we jump into it, before I crack this case open. You don't need a cinema camera. Most of my career has just been based on the A7S that I'm shooting right now, and even the A7S before it, which only shot in 1080p, didn't have any internal stabilization. I've made documentaries with it. You know, I've made viral videos with just using a cell phone, so you don't really need a cinema camera. And a lot of times there's a pressure on social media. You see all these like, you know, filmmakers that want to flex and show off all this cool gear, but they don't have the story to back it up. And there's this kind of conception and idea that you're not pro unless you have a pro camera. And I think that is a bunch of nonsense, unless you're doing, you know, like commercial shoots where, you know, you really need high resolution, raw, and all this stuff. There's definitely a lot of situations where you would need a cinema camera, and that's also why I got one. But most of filmmaking can happen with just a tool that you have. Whatever tool you have is the right tool, because if you start thinking, oh man, this DSLR isn't good enough to tell this story, I have to wait till I get the next thing, then the next thing, there's always gonna be a next thing, and you're never gonna get to actually shooting your story. So get started with what you have. And if you are starting off, more than likely, you'll need that time for practice. You'll need that project for practice to learn, to grow, before you can get to a step like this. And being confined to the limitations that a DSLR can give you, or even a phone, it has taught me so much that I would not have learned if I just jumped straight to the best and greatest out there, the newest piece of gear to make everything easier. So it's definitely been a blessing in disguise, and it also allowed me to work with brands that are just amazing, super supportive, like Samsung, like, you know, Ceramonic and the Radiographer kits, and working with musicians just in a much more affordable way than if you had to, let's say, have a camera like this, which requires bigger gear, more people. So there's definitely pros and cons, and we're gonna kind of dive into what those are. But I just want to say this because a lot of these videos, they focus so much on what is in here rather than what's in here. Okay, that was a little cheesy, but hey, it's true, it's true. So, okay, let's crack this open. Here is the main part of the setup. Here's the brain of the camera. This is a Red Komodo. It has been kitted out with a cage, a handle, a V-mount, you know, plate to convert the battery, because this has a dual Canon battery slot. Well, actually gonna skip over all the technical stuff because it's about having a cinema camera overall, and this information is gonna be irrelevant, you know, a year from now, 5 years from now. So I think the ideas are a little bit more interesting. So what made me want to get a cinema camera? So this is a culmination of a lot of work, and essentially one thing that I did notice with the gear is that I was sort of hitting a ceiling a lot of times in a lot of shoots. There are some commercial projects, as I mentioned, that do need something like this. And actually, one of the greatest regrets of not having a camera like this was, for example, on some of the commercials that I did for swimwear companies and other brands where color science was actually really important. Having that raw output and that extra information was super important. I love the S-Log 2, S-Log 3, even the cinema log that other Sony cameras have, and it's a super, super strong format, but you know, you are dealing with limitations when you're condensing all of that to a certain camera size, and it's not a, you know, pro level cinema camera. So, you know, as good as the color grading experience has been for me with grading S-Log footage and all of that, I was hitting some limitations as far as how much I can change and extract colors before breaking the footage and getting some nasty artifacts. And especially, there is a certain limitation as well with having to shoot at a higher ISO with a lot of these formats. In the first A7S, if I wanted to shoot S-Log, I had to jack up the ISO to 3200, which is a lot. And in this camera that I'm using right now, it has to be 1600. So, you know, it's far from just a regular 100, 400, and 800 ISO that, you know, going into the 800 range is usually nighttime stuff. And to have to crank it up by default as a starting point to 1600, 3200, those are crazy numbers. And again, it adds a level of noise because you're making your sensor that much more sensitive to light. And things break apart a lot more easily, especially when you're trying to push and pull colors and contrast. And the ceiling that I was hitting was, okay, I want to make the water, for example, of the waves and the background behind the model, I want that to pop. If I was trying to pull in that direction as far as the background and as far as, like, you know, getting that out of the water, you would start to mess indirectly with some of the hues on the actual bathing suit, which some of them were blue and very close to the colors that we wanted to go with the water. And that brings me again to this camera, which that kind of doesn't happen with something like this, because you're able to shoot even in its proprietary Red RAW codec, which does crazy stuff. Like, it allows you to even change the ISO, the white balance, all these other parameters that usually are baked into your footage after the fact. But that doesn't stop there. The color science alone, straight out of camera, it feels cinematic. So the amount of touch-up work, the amount of stuff that you have to do later on is very minimal. And I love that, because although the file sizes are much huger and it slows you down a little bit in that sense, it also speeds you up as far as just how much intervention you need to do on a camera like this and footage that comes out of it. So that is as far as color. Now let's move on to resolution, which I know is something that we've talked about as far as cropping. That is a huge deal. I love doing run and gun stuff. I love shooting documentaries, and a lot of times, you know, your framing, if you're just out of a car, out of a window, you're just kind of bouncing around trying to get your shot, and sometimes shooting blind, you're not gonna get the exact perfect framing that you would want. So resizing, reframing things up in some extreme scenarios where, you know, you can't plan the perfect shot on a tripod is super useful. And that was the initial magic of going from 1080 to 4K, you know, out of college, when I even upgraded to this camera right here. And that felt like a whole new world opened up to me. And in 6K, you know, even more so. And that is great for that. But also another great reason to have a higher resolution is also when you're doing stuff with green screen. I feel like I didn't have to do that to make this point, because these things are such a pain to reel back in. But when I'm using something like a green screen, having a camera like this, it just takes out so much stress out of post, because you're dealing with so much more information. That is just the real key, no pun intended, to having a great key in a green screen. You know, there's all these issues that you inevitably run into no matter how good you are setting everything up, and it can be a little frustrating. So I do a lot of VFX. I love doing VFX, and green screen is something that over the years I started to move away from and trying to figure out other alternative ways of doing it, unless I had to like rent equipment to shoot on a green screen, because I was just getting so fed up with subpar results with a DSLR, and it was starting to reflect on my skill set, which I knew wasn't the case. It's like, I know how to do a green screen, but a lot of times, again, it's that ceiling that I was hitting. And a camera like this solves that so much. Like, not just shooting 6K, but also shooting in RAW. Also being able to control the compression ratio. You can go with higher or lower ratios, which in previous lineups, it was an actual ratio. In the Red Komodo, It's more like low quality, medium quality, high quality. So they've really simplified it in those 3 tiers. And most of the times when I'm shooting, if I'm doing commercial work, I'm not even going to high quality. I'm just using medium quality just to save space. But when I'm doing stuff like this, like a green screen, high quality is a lifesaver, and it gives you so much more information that, of course, blows up your file size. But when you're doing stuff like this, you do want to have more information rather than not. And finally, my third point, which is going to seem so vain, it's going to seem so superficial and materialistic. There is something to be said about the Red brand and a cinema camera on set. It just legitimizes you in the eyes of a client. It's sometimes it shouldn't matter, but to some people it matters a lot. It's so widespread, especially in a place like LA where appearances matter more than the actual substance, and it is what it is. But hey, that's not just LA, that's a lot of other places, and I get why also. I mean, if you show up on set with something that looks legit and beefed out rather than a little DSLR, it's just gonna improve and take everything up a notch. And you know, the benefit of having something like this is also the potential jobs that you can get, the way that you can make your client happy right off the bat just by having something of this caliber. It's important to recognize that, and you know, if you can, take advantage of it, because I've seen talentless people with Red cameras get so much recognition and so many jobs that just, I'm like, what? And so having something like this just unlocks a new tier level of clients, also for good reasons, not just the showing off reason, but also because for some shoots, I mean, you can't get on Netflix with this camera, you can get on Netflix with this camera. So there's literally, you unlock a new world that you otherwise unfortunately couldn't. Also, another huge upgrade feature that's definitely worth mentioning is the global shutter that this camera in particular has. Now, rolling shutter, which is what you find in most mirrorless cameras, DSLRs, is essentially a way of capturing each frame of the image and scanning it from top to bottom, which is why sometimes you get some smearing whenever you're panning. You might get some weird image splitting whenever there's like some flickering light effects and that sort of thing. And having a global shutter, it essentially captures everything at once, which is great for handheld, whip pans, and just movement in general. With all that being said, and we said a lot, you know, let me know if you agree, disagree with me, and anything on the comment section below. I definitely want to have a conversation. So I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, give it a like, subscribe to this channel for more filmmaking stuff. And yeah, with all that being said, my name is Kriscoart for Kriscoart, and I'll see you next time.
Honestly, I don't know who the fuck to trust. Is she my friend or my foe? I'm off the exit, draw. Yeah, she give me that claim as well. I remember back when I was younger, I was happy. Nowadays feel like no one understand me. I'm good at artists, silly on Bob, Bambi. Baby's yellow, text. She wanna eat me like candy. Run up the racks, track me. I'll run up the racks like an athlete. Big facts, you're the dick, 6 flags. Ballin' like big facts, told her I love her. I ain't really mean that, yeah.